Welcome to Chapter 3. We're going to discuss the political economy and economic development. So, in the previous chapters, um, we talked about how countries differ in regards to their political systems, economic systems, legal systems. In this chapter, we're going to look more closely at explain how these differences in their political economy influences the level of economic development in that country. You know, Basically, we're going to try and discuss how attractive a country is for conducting business. And we'll look at uh, different aspects of what makes a region or a nation business friendly and open to entrepreneurship of its citizens and innovation of its economy. Now, over the past 30 or 40 years, there's there's certainly been a move and a change to more democratic forms of government with that have market-based economic economies. Even some non-democratic countries um, have moved to a more market-based economy by making many economic reforms, the adoption of a more stable and fair legal system, enforcement of property rights, enforcement of patent and copyright law, with the goal of trying to foster a more productive economy. Uh, the way these countries figure is if our citizens are more productive, more wealthy, they generate more income. This will generate more tax and make for a stable, stronger country. And of course, in today's world, international business has to be a huge section of any country if they want to prosper. They can't do it alone um, at all. Now, there's a lot of change in the world. If we look at Egypt recently, we've seen, just the past couple of months, a lot of change in development, changeover in the government. And if you read the opening part of this chapter, it talks about how, at different times in Egypt's history, their economy actually looked pretty good and things were um, moving in a good trajectory. But due to corruption, uh, due to certain parties' grips on power or the mechanism of their state economy, secret police, oppression, control of media, um, you know, these things hinder an economy and prevent it from prospering and steal from the economy. So, the Egyptian people realize this and they've been working to, develop a democracy and in some cases seeing the benefits of secular democracy to try to, pursue more market-based reforms uh, to better the economic ability of its citizens in the country as a whole. Different countries have different levels of economic development, and it depends on how we're measuring their economic development of a country. One way we can measure this is through gross national income, which is sort of looking at income, the income level per person. Now, sort of a yardstick for the economic activity of a country, measures the total annual income received by the residents of the nation. Uh, you know, so you have rich countries like Japan, Switzerland, Sweden, France, Germany, United States among the richest on this measure, and large countries like China, India among the poorest. Japan, for example, had a gross national income of 40 in dollar terms, 41,000, 40 or close to 42,000, while China had a gross national income of about 4,000, while India had a gross national income of about 1,500. So you can see there's a huge difference in national incomes by what country you're in. But this can sometimes be a little misleading because you have to figure in the cost of living. Just like if you're for the different costs of living, different countries around the world come in at different levels. Also, even within the United States, it's much more expensive to live in just in New York State alone. It's a lot more expensive to live in, say, Nassau County or Manhattan than it is to say live in Geneseo. For example, In Switzerland, their gross national income is $71,000 a year, um, which is much higher than the United States. Um, but the cost of living in Switzerland, you know, is much higher. So the U.S. citizen could actually afford more goods and services than the Swiss citizen. So where a house may cost 300,000 in the United States, a house in Switzerland could cost 1 million, same house. So cost of living can vary greatly. Uh, a lot of times we'll refer to the purchasing power parity, or the triple P. And this adjustment allows for more direct comparison of living standards between different countries. And it's, the base adjustment, you know, is the cost of living in the United States. So the PPP for different countries is then adjusted up or down depending upon whether the cost of living is higher or lower than the United States. For example, in China, the gross national income is about 4,000, but the purchase price parity brings it up to closer to 8,000, suggesting the cost of living in China is lower, and that the $4,000 that you make in China will buy close to $8,000 in the United States. So this is something that we're familiar with, even in like I said, across the United States. So here's a map where if we look at a pretty interesting map, and it comes from the textbook. And if we look at in the red areas, we have the upper higher income, and we go from red to orange to yellow, and as we go down the scale, the incomes, the gross national income in U.S. dollars becomes lower. So you see that a majority of the lowest gross national incomes are in Africa, and the majority of the higher incomes are in Europe and North America. So there's quite a difference among the world as far as these incomes. Okay. Now here's a chart where we could look at the gross national per capita versus the gross national adjusted for purchasing power parity, and we could see that there are different growth rates in all these economies and size of their economies. So there's a good amount of dispersion or change going from one country to another, and you'll see that some of the countries are very rich while some of the countries are still developing. So if we look at economic development as far as annual growth of gross national product, we'll see that in the red areas are growing the fastest, and in the blue areas are growing the slowest. Now, so you'll see that Asia is actually the fastest growing area in the world, where North America is some of the slowest growth. But if you get a 3% growth on a $12 trillion economy, that's a huge amount of actual total dollars of growth compared to a 10% growth on a $100 billion economy. So some of these red areas in Africa and Asia are actually quite small economies, and it's easy for them to grow quickly. Just like a small company, it's a lot easier for a small company to double their sales than it would be for a much larger company to double their sales. So sometimes what we see in some of the cooler regions are developed countries that have already a pretty large economy. So the growth rate, even though they may be slow in the United States, it's still generating more wealth and more growth in total dollar terms just based on the size of the economy. Okay, so let's look at some broader concepts of development. Okay, now one thing we want to talk about is economists, sometimes argue that development should be assessed not necessarily by the material output measured in money or gross national income, but more about the capabilities and opportunities that the people in the country enjoy. So, according to Sen, development should be seen as a process of expanding the real freedoms of the people experience, and developing the openness of the economy and people's rights. Um, and so this development requires removal of um, anything that impedes freedom. Um, so places where there are, poor economic opportunities and poor systematic social programs that neglect public facilities, you know, and tolerate repression of its people. Um, in Sen's view, development is not just an economic process, but a political one too. And to succeed requires democratization of political economies, to give citizens a voice and a feeling of the ability to be an entrepreneurial freedom and an ability to be innovative, for the economy to grow and be more prosperous. Um, so um, Sen emphasizes, basic health care, especially for children, education, rights for women. Um, these are all should be factors in, the concept of development. Now, United Nations created a HDI, which is Human Development Index, and this measures the quality of human life in different nations, and it's based on three measures: life expectancy from birth, um, educational attainment, which usually includes adult literacy rate, um, enrollment in schools, graduation rates, and also average incomes. Using the adjusting for purchasing power parity. Um, so these inputs, um, are they sufficient to meet the basic needs of life in the country? Adequate food, shelter, healthcare. So the HDI comes much closer to Sen's concept of how development should be measured, um, than a narrow economic measurement of just gross national income. Many factors should be looked at. So income alone isn't the only, for example, if you make the same income in the United States that you might make in, say, Sweden. However, in Sweden, you're provided free health care and free college and free, what they call cradle to grave care, where they take care of their people and all the expenses from birth into being buried. Then making the same salary in Sweden would certainly, you would certainly have a life with more development and advancement in it than, say, in a country where you made the same salary but had to pay for your own health care and had to pay for the majority of your education and welfare and health. So this scale is actually 0 to 1, where countries scoring less than 0.5 are classified as low human development, and countries scoring 0.5 to 0.8 are classified as medium, and of course anything over 0.8 would be classified as having a higher human development. Okay, so you don't have to, and you shouldn't really look on a country's development with just income alone. So if we look at some of these broader levels of human development that we just talked about, we could see that again in Europe and in North America has a higher level of human development, where the median, Asia, South America has more of a medium, where some nations in Africa have a lower level of development. So it's not too far off from the economics, the pure monetary economic scales, but it's just another way of kind of observing things, looking at things. So here's a question for you. What is the relationship between political and economic progress? So I want you to think about that for a second. So what is the relationship between the political progress a country makes, especially towards freedoms of its citizens and liberties of its citizens, compared to the economic progress those countries are going to enjoy? Is there a relationship between these two factors? And I think most of us agree that economic freedom in a market economy creates greater incentives for innovation and entrepreneurship than a planned or mixed economy. So if a person can take greater responsibility and reap more of the rewards of their own efforts, they become motivated and incentivized to be more innovative and more entrepreneurial. And we see countries that when countries start engaging their citizens and encouraging them through more political freedoms, then their economies grow quickly um, because of this. So if we look at innovation, and entrepreneurships, and what is their involvement in the growth of economies, and I think everyone will agree that innovation and entrepreneurial activities are really the power behind long-running, stable economic growth. And if you look at a country, say, like the United States over the past 50 years, their high amount of citizens engaging in entrepreneurial, innovative practices helped develop and create a lot of the world's technology. I mean, in the United States, we developed the car, the airplane, the television, the internet, um, the microwave oven, uh, the computer. Many things were due to this entrepreneurial and innovative spirit. We developed many of the world's innovations in consumer products, as well as pharmaceuticals and things of that nature. And there's even one area we can look at, which was pharmaceuticals. For a long time, France was number one in research, development, and creation and production of new medical um, drugs and procedures and equipment. Then at one point, the French government got involved and told the pharmaceutical countries in France that, we're going to put limitations on what you can charge for your medications. So you can only charge this much for your medications, and we're going to allow generic manufacturers in a lot quicker. So they decentivized the French economy from producing innovative and entrepreneurial endeavors in the pharmaceutical industry. So what happened? Well, a lot of the research development moved to the United States, and a lot of pharmaceutical companies started to dominate the world from the United States, because in the United States they were able to reap the rewards of their research development and charge whatever they wanted for their medications. Now, that's not necessarily great for people that have to pay for them, and that was the motivation of the French government for limiting the cost of certain medications. Also, the Canadian government does this too, what pharmaceuticals can charge for their medications. So this really, in those countries, that industry died. But in the United States, that industry was developed and flourished and became a dominant world force, bringing huge amounts of profits back to the United States and developing many jobs in the area as well. Okay. Um, so innovation, um, it's not just new products; it's also the process, new processes, new organizations, new management practices, new strategies. You know, um, so it's anything that companies do, like Walmart developing, this widely successful low-cost distribution system, or Amazon are developing an online retailing environment and distribution system, or Netflix figuring out a streaming and mail order content provider of entertainment. I mean, these are all innovative companies that help to create a new industry and develop huge amounts of sales and profits. So entrepreneurship activities really exploded with the internet, where more and more um, individuals or small groups of people could make um, entry into business and reach a more global opportunities and bigger markets with smaller amount of capital. But as long as they had very innovative or very entrepreneurial type websites, or even applications for iPhone or Android, they're able to make a sizable amount of profit for themselves and boost the economic activity of their country. So, all right. So let me just resize this. If we look at this, I have to hold on one second. Sorry about that. I was just resizing the screen. Um, Now, if you look at these companies, you may not be familiar with them, but these are companies started by Chinese entrepreneurs, and China has been a huge environment for entrepreneurial innovative activities. And much of this can be seen in the growth and the dynamic change in the Chinese economy over the past 10 years, which um, is overall very good for the country. The citizens of the country are becoming wealthier, and the entire world is participating in the growth of the Chinese economy because it's an international growth. So you'll see much. I think you'll see much more entrepreneurship and innovation coming out of China over the next 10 to 20 years. Okay. Now, why does innovation entrepreneurship require a market economy? Um, so, well, should I add? I should ask, does it require a market economy? But you know, what is required for business environment of a country is to foster an environment that's conducive to innovative and entrepreneurship activity, encouragement, support, capital, loans to small businesses. So countries with high economic freedoms generally have high economic growth and richer citizens. So that is a commonality that we could see across the world. And countries that lack economic freedom, fail to generate significant economic growth. So, market economies do have their advantages, and it's been argued that economic freedoms associated with a strong market economy will create greater incentives for innovation and entrepreneurship because they will keep the benefits of the profits that they make in this environment. So now, in a mixed or planned economy, you have more governmental control and more regulation and more red tape, which sometimes will discourage the innovation or the entrepreneurial spirit because they can't get anything done due to the government getting in their way too often. So, in a market economy, any individual who has an innovative idea is free to try and make money out of the idea by starting a business and engaging in an entrepreneurial activity. So what's really important in encouraging this is that when someone has an idea for a business or they want to be entrepreneurial in nature, that the the regulations of the government make it easy for them to form a business entity, a partnership, sole proprietorship, or corporation, and have access to capital to fund and move their idea forward so they can bring it to a point where profits can be made and the company can grow and further employees can be hired. And the easier it is for someone to do that within a country, the more likely that they will and the more economic growth they'll bring to that economy. All right. Now, in order to have an entrepreneurship environment and foster innovation, legal protections of property rights are definitely a must. Um, so for the business environment to encourage innovation and entrepreneurial activity, which results in economic growth, both individual and businesses must be given the opportunity to profit from their innovative ideas. Without strong copyright and property protection, businesses and individuals run the risk that profits from their hard work and effort in innovating a new idea, coming up with a new product or procedure or medication, will be taken away from them by either another company, a competitor, another nation state, or even a criminal enterprise. So protecting these profits encourage and foster an environment where people don't get discouraged by theft of their hard work. Now, in some aggressively regulated countries, they can also diminish the opportunities by excessive taxation, demands for kickbacks and red tape, licenses for doing business. So um, these are things that prevent other countries from being very entrepreneurial. There is a Nobel Prize economist, Douglas North, um, who did a lot of work in this area, and he says, throughout history, many governments displayed a tendency to engage in the behavior of holding back innovation. Inadequate enforcement of property rights reduced the incentives for innovation, entrepreneurial activity. Um, because if it's likely that the profits from this work will be stolen, why get involved in it? Now, there's another economist, Soto or De Soto, who was hired by a number of South American governments, and he basically helped turn around, I believe, the Chilean economy uh, when they had big deficits and crises and things of that. And and he basically convinced some of these countries in South America that in order to have a capitalistic or free market environment, it's never going to occur unless property rights are defined, protected, and recognized. Um, DeSoto argues that because the key problem is not the risk of um, of stolen ideas, but the chronic inability of property owners to establish legal title to the property they own, and therefore sell it or raise capital with it. Um, so one aspect that he would highlight was that in Haiti, individuals would have to take 173 different steps over 19 years to own land legally. Um, because in many of these poor countries, land is informally owned. You live on it, you grow your crops on it, your family's there, you own it. But there's no legal proof of you owning it. So banks are not going to lend money to a startup based on the idea that you own this land with no property rights to back up proof that you actually own the property. So it holds people back from being able to raise capital to redistribute capital from their assets into entrepreneurial businesses. Now, of course, democratic regimes in countries that foster democracy are more, conducive to long-term economic growth than dictatorships. Even well-meaning, benevolent dictatorships, because there's going to be some level of um, limiting human expression development, and that's going to limit the progress of, you know. Now, sometimes democracy will come uh, as a consequence of economic growth, and we see this in South Korea and Thailand, and um, and a lot of these free countries have an attitude, these Western governments, towards human rights violations in many countries. Um, Now, as China keeps opening up its free markets and developing its more open economy, human rights and greater individual freedoms will most likely be a result of doing this. So, even though the Chinese government will try to control certain aspects of Chinese life and Chinese businesses, as they move towards a more freer and freer market, they see the benefits of an expanding economy, but that's also going to encourage their citizens to pursue more individual freedoms, and specifically in the areas where they may want to protect businesses they want to own or entrepreneurial ideas they want to develop. All right. So let's talk geography, education, and economic progress. Now, education, of course, is a huge factor um, in economic progress. You need to have an educated population. The more educated the population is, the easier it is, of course, to develop profits in businesses and generate growth in the economy. Now, if we look at geography, this influences economic policy as well and economic decisions. So if you have a favorable geography, you're more likely to engage in trade and promote economic growth. For example, if you're a country like the United States that has access to the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean, that's geographically a very convenient position to be in. It's going to foster a lot of trade. Unlike a country that might be landlocked, like say the Ukraine, that is not going to have as much access to the open oceans. Now, um, it's true that a country's political and economic systems are probably um, the big engine that drives the rate of economic growth, but education and geography are also important factors. Um, um, Geography can influence economic policy, economic growth rates. If you have a country, let's say like the United States or China or Canada or Russia, where you have access to oceans, you have a lot of geography that can contribute farmlands, mineral lands, natural energy reserves. This is all going to help the development of the country. You know, um, so if your country has, you know, um, good soil, good weather, um, this is all going to contribute. And generally, the larger size of the country, the more opportunities you'll have for many different contributing factors to help aid their growth of their economy. Now, education, of course, is another important factor in economic development. So, the better you can educate your citizens, the more chances you'll have at developing the skills necessary to develop businesses and innovations. Um, so nations that invest more in education will have higher growth rates because an educated population is more productive. That's one of the arguments in the United States is that if you own a house, you're paying anywhere from $6,000 to $12,000 in property tax, and of that property tax in Long Island, a good 80% is going to the school district. Now corporations get the benefit of all these educated people who go to high school, go to college, and that's why one of the arguments for corporations paying a little bit more tax is to help fund these schools and universities because they're reaping the benefits of all these highly educated, well-trained individuals. They should be putting a little bit more money back into contribute more to the economic systems of the country, where most of the the educational systems of the country are paid for by either homeowners who pay a tax that goes into the school districts, or individuals that pay for themselves to go to college, and there's very little or no state support to go to college. So corporations contribute very little in this aspect. The only area where corporations do contribute is some companies do have tuition reimbursement policies, and that would be sort of a direct way where the companies can sort of help finance the education, and that's why companies promote tuition assistance reimbursement, because they know a more educated workforce results in a more successful company. Um, Now, in a comparison, say in the 60s, Pakistan and the South Koreans were equal as far as economic performance. However, just 30% of Pakistani children were enrolled in primary schools, and 94% of South Koreans were enrolled. By the mid 80s, South Korea, their gross national product per person was 3 times that of Pakistan. And today, in the time we're in today, it's more like 4 or 5 times. So, education definitely helps countries to succeed. And Korea is a great example of that because not only did they go to school all week long and on Saturday, and many students have private tutors after school and they go to school for more hours than American students. All this education has definitely, if you look at the measure of success of the Korean economy since the 60s to today, definitely shows a contributing factor in their excessively fast transition from a third world economy to a first world economy. Um, so that's just common sense. Now, we talk about states in transition. We have a lot of countries around the world where um, they have changed dramatically, since the 80s, and there tends to be have been a couple different trends in this. Um, in the late 80s and early 90s, a wave of democratic revolutions swept the world, and dictatorship governments collapsed and were replaced by democratically elected governments that were committed to free markets and the benefits of free markets. And there's been a strong move away from central planning and mixed economies towards a more free market, simply because the success has been there. The free markets, led by the United States, have proven that it's a more successful system for generating wealth for a nation. You know, okay. So the spread of democracy, um, you know, over the past 50 years, the spread of democracy has been pretty consistent. Um, so more and more countries and citizens of the world have been choosing to have uh, a revolution or a change or a coup in government to bring in a more democratic process. Um, free freedoms and liberties in countries because it's what the citizens are demanding. And with today's technology of Twitter and Facebook, citizens can more easily mobilize and uh, let governments know in mass protests that they're not going to take it anymore. If you look at Egypt, the spring, the Middle East spring, where they deposed the dictator who's been there for 40 plus years, and then a year later they rose up again and got the president that they elected out of power. You can see that it's a different world dynamic now with the way of communications that people have. You know, so there are definitely economic advantages to being a democratic economy because they generally have more protections for the citizens in their entrepreneurial endeavors. And states just realize they can't control people like they used to because of technology and the internet and cell phones. It's just too hard to censor all this information. So there's really, in many cases, no choice but to move into a more democratic world. In this slide, we'll see that the red countries are free, politically free, and more of a market economy. Uh, the green countries are partly free, still somewhat of a mixed economy, government still heavily involved. And the yellow countries are considered not free, where the government has a high level of control over business and the citizens and its market. Although even in the yellow countries, they may not have a high level of freedom, many of these countries are still pursuing more economic open markets, making a more slower transition. Now, just to back to this map for a second. There are some countries like Venezuela that are moving into a different direction, more socialistic direction, and they're sort of in the minority. Um, if we look at, I guess for a lot of the world, when the dictatorships and the totalitarianism and social heavily socialized or communistic countries weren't able to produce the economic progress, that it was no longer easy to conceal that people in every part of the world know how Americans or Europeans live. And when they see that their country isn't anywhere close to that, the people are going to demand change. Um, so the stagnant economies of the communist and social models, really, these populations just um, wouldn't stand for it anymore. And the economic success of many newer democracies, such as Poland, the Czech Republic, Philippines, Taiwan, Asia, Chile, Ukraine, um, this just encouraged more and more governments and countries to become more democratically based. And like I said before, the information and communications and technologies, fax machines, cell phones, computers, internet, um, blogs, wikis, YouTube. They reduce the ability for state to have control over its citizens. The message gets out there, the information gets out there. So um, the economies are becoming free based on the technology that the governments really can't control too easily anymore. All right. So let's move to this new world order and global terrorism. So we have the end of the Cold War between Russia and the United States, and that sort of all disintegrated in 1990. It's the collapse of communism. The changeover for many countries around the world from moving from dictatorships to more democracies. Um, it's really changed the shape of the world. So Western democracies are becoming, you know, um, more prevalent around the world. So um, these geopolitical forces are now not so much country versus country, but um, it can be even a much smaller subset in religion or ideas or a small part of a population of a country that now can wage a global terrorism. So we don't see wars between countries like we used to. Instead, we see hostilities between certain groups of people who can now mobilize their ideas and thoughts through technology and utilize more terroristic tactics to get their point across. So this has an important ramification for businesses that not only do they have to deal with foreign governments and foreign regulation and foreign economic systems, but they also have to deal with the threat of being kidnapped, terrorism, and other groups that promote hate and distrust and cause the economy to be stifled because business people aren't going to want to invest in those countries or travel to those countries if they feel threatened. You know. Okay. So again, getting back to this subject of the spread of the market-based economies. Um, so with the changeover to more democracies in the 80s and 90s, and changeover from the centrally planned, commanding heights of economies to more market-based economies, and again, like I said earlier, you had countries led by England and Margaret Thatcher saying, why should the state make all the decisions? Because historically, most of the decisions we made as a state weren't optimal, weren't optimized. Let the market-based economy optimize the decisions and the movement of goods and utilities and power and labor to what's most effective. Um, so you had over 30 countries in the former Soviet Union and the Eastern European bloc that changed over to more market-based economic system. uh, and the rationale for this economic transformation has been the same all over the world. In general, command and mixed economies fail to deliver the kind of sustained economic performance and success and welfare for its citizens than more market-based. So you have countries like United States, Switzerland, Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea. Um, so as their success, if you can see these countries transform to very successful countries, that market-based model has been other countries have been looking to adopt that market-based model to gain some of that wealth. Um, so it's that's the real draw to that type of world. And here we could see the spread of the market-based economy based on economic freedom. So the more economic freedom you have, the closer you are to a market-based economy. You know, so okay, I'm back. Sorry about that. Let's look at the nature of economic transformation. Okay, so if we want to shift from um, we want to shift towards a market-based economy, one big thing is deregulation. And deregulation involves the government stepping back from businesses, removing restrictions, um, and letting the markets establish private enterprises and letting the private enterprises control and operate the industries. So in governments where they control the commanding heights of the economy and they plan all the output and prices, that's the most highly regulated industries you could have. So the regulations really discourage innovation, entrepreneurship, or expansion of business. But when economies are deregulated, they remove these barriers and allow the markets to establish what they think is best through competition. Now, for example, in the 70s, airlines were regulated. So the government told airlines who could fly out of which airport, what routes they could fly, how often the routes would fly, how much food they could serve on the in flight, what flight attendants could wear, how many hours a pilot could work. They regulated the whole airline industry. And then in the late 70s, early 80s, they deregulated the industry. So, what was the results of deregulation of the airline industry? So, as a result, two main things happened in the airline industry. One, the cost of flights went down dramatically. For example, a flight from New York to California in the 70s, inflation adjusted, would be about $1,500–$1,600 per person. Today, it's closer to $300. Also, the number of people flying and the frequency of their flights has gone up by a factor of 20. So there's a lot more planes in the air, there are a lot more people flying, and there are a lot lower costs. And they also have a better safety record now that they're deregulated. So the airline industry has been one of the successes of deregulation. However, one side note is that because of this deregulation in the airline industry, we've seen many airliners go bankrupt. But bankruptcy isn't necessarily a bad thing. If a weak airline goes bankrupt, say like Braniff Air that used to fly out of MacArthur to Florida, they go bankrupt, and a stronger carrier like Southwest comes in and develops and maintains the routes better at lower prices, this is a good thing. So bankruptcy gets rid of the weak airlines for stronger and better organized companies to come and take their place, and that also evolves the industry and provides better transportation for individuals. Okay, and second, we have privatization. Now, privatization is the transfer of ownership from state-owned properties into private hands. So, a state-owned oil industry or the state-owned construction or energy or coal mining or natural gas, or it just, you take these state-owned enterprises and you just sell them to the public. So privatization is a way to stimulate gains in economic efficiency by giving new private owners a powerful incentive, the reward of making greater profits, and the motivation for research and development to increase productivity and increase profits and move into new markets and exit losing ones. So privatization, the governments have shown that they run things at a loss or they run things very inefficiently. Privatization has shown to be much more successful. So this was basically started in the 80s by Margaret Thatcher in Great Britain, followed by the United States, and they started deregulating things like telecommunications, state-owned monopolies on many areas, including coal mining, and it was widely very successful, although very painful to make this transition. A lot of people get laid off, jobs are displaced, unions are sometimes dismantled. So, but over time, privatization has seemed to have become a successful strategy for many countries. And in Europe, where a lot of countries are facing huge deficits, some of the socialistic countries, they're having problems, such as Greece. They're starting to privatize and sell off the commanding heights of their economies to raise money and spur the economy. And thirdly, we have the creation of a legal system that's going to safeguard property rights and encourage business. And we talked about this somewhat in Chapter 2. So having a good, strong legal system is also going to be a key to a successful market-based economy. I'm a little behind in the slides here. Deregulation, of course, we just talked about this. And some things that when we deregulate a market, we remove price controls, um, such as in the airline industry. At one time, there were price controls on gasoline, so I had the gasoline lines in the 70s. Abolish laws limiting private enterprise, so we allow private enterprise, encourage citizens to take up private enterprise, um, remove restrictions on foreign investment and trade to encourage companies, foreign companies to invest and hire in the United States. Now, with the privatization, what we talked about just a second ago, um, operationally, private enterprises perform more effectively and efficiently than state-run enterprises. And this is, the more business-oriented the enterprise is, the better the privatization works. In some cases, the United States has a very um, highly regulated medical care system that is very expensive. If it was deregulated and privatized a little bit more, it's mostly private to begin with, but if it was a little bit more of a market-based economy in the medical community, costs wouldn't be so insane. One example could be LASIK surgery. LASIK surgery falls out of um, insurance, so the insurance doesn't cover LASIK. 90% of or 95% of most insurance plans and coverages don't cover LASIK eye correction surgery. So it was a free market environment. So in the beginning, to get LASIK surgery, five, $10,000, till today, $1,000, or somewhere around there. And why did the prices fall so dramatically in LASIK surgery, even though the technology had advanced and the equipment was getting more expensive? It was the competition among doctors to get patients that lowered the costs, improved the quality, and lowered the cost of the procedure. Now, if all medical um, offices work similar to that, where you had more of a choice and more of a say in researching and looking for what you're going to pay, maybe the cost would fall in that greater environment as well. But to be fair, I'm not an expert in healthcare or hospitals or medical economics. Some of you who I know work in these fields are probably have a lot more to say about this, or could give me a few pointers of where I'm totally off, and I would not disagree with you. This is just a generalization of an example, so don't read into it too much. But you kind of get the gist of what I'm saying. Okay, and of course, legal systems, we covered that. Now, what are some of the implications of changing um, of a political economy? For the global changes in political and economic systems that we talked about, have implications for international businesses. So long-standing, conflicts between collectivism and individualism that defines the 20th century is a little bit less evident today as the world's moving more and more to a total market-based economy. Um, so it remains to be seen if how successful this is going to be when these free market economics start moving into markets that typically have been outside of this competition area for long periods of time. We have 2.5 billion people in India and China that were outside of this type of market, a completely open and free market for a long period of time, that are both moving towards this market. And that's going to potentially change the world in many ways. One way is there enough resources in the world for everybody to live like an American? So in the United States, we're 6% of the world's population, but we consume 25% of the world's resources, goods, and services. Because, we all have, a lot of people in America have a house and a car, or two cars, a dishwasher, um, washer and dryer, um, pool, but not above ground. Heavens no, we have to have the in-ground pool with the $30,000 of brickwork around it, maybe throw in a hot tub, $25,000 deck, We have a lot of we consume a lot of energy and through our possessions and through what we consume. That's our lifestyle. What if the other, you know, 9 billion people in the world all had cars and houses and washing machines and dishwashers and pools and hot tubs and decks and paved driveways? Would there be enough resources and materials in the world to give everybody this lifestyle? Enough energy? Would we consume so much energy that we throw ourselves into an extreme global climate disruption? So things I worry about and questions I sometimes ask. Um, okay, but the ride of the ever increasing size of the global economy has a lot of potential risks, but there's also a lot of potential gain. And I'm looking forward to hopefully at least 30 or 50 more years of increased economic growth for the world economy, because that's going to result in economic growth for people who own stock, and for people like us who have 401ks and stock-based retirement plans. We're counting on this momentum occurring until we retire, so our stocks will at least help us have enough money saved for retirement. All right. So benefits. I mean, the benefits are pretty clear. Um, you know, increased wealth, purchasing power of consumers in the marketplace, um, more wealthy, more of a middle class being developed that can consume, um, more large markets with bigger numbers of consumers, um, where living standards are going to increase. Um, so the benefits of doing business in the country are really going to be a function of its market size and its purchasing power of its consumers. So if you enter in a country that is going to be relatively large country and the consumers are going to purchase a great deal, that's going to be a lot of huge benefits for companies and businesses, and even general people. Now, a key thing is um, for companies to be able to identify and invest early in these potential future markets. So international firms need to start building brand loyalty. Pepsi and Coke have been at this the longest, I think, and they've built a lot of brand loyalty around the world. Um, and they've paid, you know, a fair amount of growth in their stock and dividends, um, as the world has become able to afford more Coke and Pepsi. That's as a small example. But for other businesses, they really have to focus on their first mover advantages, getting into the market, establishing themselves as a force in the market, and gaining the acknowledgement and awareness of its of the population. So there is a lot of benefits for companies to, even if they're taking a loss, to establish a position for their brands in some of these larger countries like India and China, because they're going to be the future growth of the world in the next 100 years. But with benefits, there always come costs. So, in three, if you're doing business in a foreign country, um, you're definitely going to be there's definitely going to be political costs, paying bribes, which are illegal for American companies to do, but lobbying for favorable and fair treatment for the causes of your business isn't necessarily illegal for American companies to do. And a lot of foreign companies and foreign governments have lobbyists that lobby our Washington elected officials for favorable treatment for their companies or countries, is quite a common. Economic costs. Uh, when you have a more sophisticated economic system, the infrastructure and the support you need increases the costs. For example, they're widening the Panama Canal so bigger boats can come through, and that's going to cost a lot of money to upgrade the docks in the United States to be able, the ports in the United States to be able to receive these larger boats, just as an example. But if they do, there'll be a bigger, an easier and lower cost to world trade. And of course, the legal costs can be higher in countries because there's dramatically different legal protocols and costs for setting up workplaces and hiring employees and pollution standards and protection of property and defending your property rights across many countries. And of course, we don't want to forget the risks. We have doing businesses in foreign markets that could entail political risks. The risk that one day a country um, is a nice competitive marketplace. The next day there's revolution, and foreign companies are taken over and turned into state enterprises. I mean, it can happen. It's happened many times before. Um, Economic risk, the risk that these high trading hedge funds destroy the economy or excessively credit happy bank and institutions over extend the lending of and create a global credit crisis um, like in 2008 can adversely affect profits in business enterprises. This boom and bust recession and expansion economic risks and legal risks that laws could change that can limit your opportunities or weaken your property rights. So these are all things that we've talked about before. Now, so if you're gonna, expand your company into foreign markets, all these risks and potential benefits and costs and risks have to be balanced in a way that management have to make the decision to the overall attractiveness of, where they're going to invest. So hopefully they can invest somewhere where the corruption and infrastructure and legal costs are all conducive to doing business. That the benefits of the size of the economy and the growth of the economy of that nation state will be beneficial, and the risks are minimized. That the political and economic environment are stable. Where we find this is typically where we're going to find a lot of foreign direct investment. All right. Now, in many cases, people will accept these risks, knowing that there's a high cost or high political risks. They may accept these in order to get the high growth that some of the less developed nations have. That in the beginning, when many companies moved into China, it wasn't really. It was very risky proposition, and they weren't sure politically or economically what was going to develop. But they knew that China had such strong growth that they were willing to take those risks in a bet, hoping that they'd be able to get in there and establish themselves and be able to take advantage of a very strong Chinese economy before their competitors. So these are all things that, of course, here's a graphical display of the overall attractiveness I was talking about before. So you get the general idea that, the world's an ever-changing place, and economies from country to country differ greatly. And, in today's world, it's never been a more open or free world, and there's never been more market-based economies available for companies to expand into. So this all does set the stage up for a high growth environment over the next 20 or 30 years as the rest of the world comes online with this market environment. So it'll be very interesting to see how companies take advantage of these opportunities and what they mean for overall world growth. And certainly we've seen a huge amount of people lifted out of poverty over the past 20 years, and I certainly hope that continues over the next 20 to even 100 years moving forward. Okay, that's it for Chapter 3. I will see you soon for Chapter 4.